St. Lorraine on the factory floor, painting the gauges for Chevys and Fords. Fall for St. Paul on the night that you meet by Sears Roebuck House on Jackson Street. Oh, change gon' come, it's coming for everyone. Welcome on, it's coming for everyone. Tidy house, your kitchen is clean and your children moved out. Frame your beliefs with a blackberry crown, and remember how red you once painted the town. Oh, change gon' come, it's coming for everyone. Welcome on, it's coming for everyone. Oh, St. Lorraine in your Sunday bed, your kitchen is clean and you're due for a rest. We file into the church with a weight in the chest, and walk out to a different town than we left. Oh, change gon' come, it's coming for everyone. Welcome on, it's coming for everyone. The house is still standing, but the one that I knew was the one that gave shelter to you.
Hello, thank you, Nick Droz. That was fantastic. Really great way to kick off the evening. Hello, everyone. I'm Tree Swenson. I'm the executive director at Hugo House. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land. This is the traditional territory of Coast Salish peoples. And one of the reasons, just one of the reasons that we want to acknowledge Native Americans is their very strong storytelling traditions. And Hugo House is a place for writers to gather and to craft the stories that people most need to hear in these difficult times. So welcome to tonight's literary series. We have Ijeoma Oluo, Tarfia Faizullah, and welcoming back, Lidia Yuknavitch. The theme tonight, our literary series always has a theme around which each of our writers and the musician focus their work. The theme tonight is There Goes the Neighborhood. And the concept when we picked this theme back, last August, July, June, about a year ago, was that we would have moved into our brand new home, which is going to be just around the corner across from Cal Anderson. It's our old home, and in the meantime, we're in a temporary location. But surprise, surprise, it's construction, and we only last week started, like Thursday of last week, started construction on the interior. So this is a really big deal. We've just picked the contractor and they've done the floors, and I hear that the studs are starting to go up. So it's a really exciting thing for a small organization like Hugo House to have the opportunity to buy our own home on Capitol Hill. So there will always be a place for writers here in the heart of the city. We're very lucky to founders and early supporters of Hugo House for making this possible. But they put up about half the money, and we have been madly racing the clock to raise the other half of the money. But we're doing really well. Out of a 7.5 million goal, I think we're down to about 450,000 that we don't know where it's coming from. So we're really close, but we're still really far away. So thank you to all of you if you have already given to the Capital campaign. Thank you. We just could not possibly do this without the community's help. And you will notice in your program there is a little descriptor of what the new house is going to be, along with a very convenient envelope should you be moved to make a contribution. So this is the last literary series of the year. It's actually the last of any of our big major series. It doesn't mean we aren't doing continuing programming here and there over this summer, but when we come back, our next year's series will be opening in our brand new home on 11th Avenue. So this is sort of a fond farewell to our transitional period. So tonight, Peter Mountford, our events curator, is going to MC the evening, but before I bring him up, and he will tell you the drill, but we will have an intermission, and during the intermission, I would really appreciate it if then or at the end of the evening you could please fill out the surveys that are in your programs. We have sponsors, and they really want to know from us who is here. So we can't tell them unless you tell us. We then thank our sponsors: Amazon, Arts Fund, For Culture, Arts Washington, the Office of Arts and Culture, National Endowment for the Arts, Cafe Vita, Elliott Bay Book Company, what's that? The Sorrento Hotel, I know I was missing someone, and the Stranger A&P, and a media partner along with KUOW. So thank you all for coming. Peter.
Thank you, Drew. Thank you all. Thank you so much for coming here. This is our first event here at Northwest Film Forum, and it's really cool to be here. And this is, yes, our fourth and final lit series of the year. And before we get started, we do have one scheduled for the fall. I want to let you know, and I'm not going to tell you about it, but it's really exciting, and there'll be more to come. And we do actually have one more event in our series, which is going to be in August, featuring Ben Lerner. I'll tell you a little bit about that later. Quickly, the format for the evening is that before intermission, we will hear work from Ijeoma Oluo and another song from Nick Droz. After intermission, we'll hear from Tarfia Faizullah and more music, and finally, Lidia Yuknavitch. As you probably know, the way this event works is that we commission new work on the same theme from 3 writers and a musician, and they come here to perform it for the first time. Tonight's theme, as Tree mentioned, is There Goes the Neighborhood. And it was supposed to be funny, like Hugo House is coming back to the neighborhood. There goes the neighborhood. That was the thought. But then we didn't get back in time. So now it's something else. The whole season has this overarching theme of sort of real estate as a result of our move. Back when I was a hack economist for this super corrupt and sketchy think tank, which is it's a true story. It was later chased out of business, thank God. They called me their token liberal to my face. I co-authored a report called There Goes the Neighborhood Up. And this was, It was funded by Freddie Mac, and the upshot was that despite what racists claim, when immigrants move into a neighborhood, the property values actually rise. My bosses tried to sneak the sentence, "Is this just a Reagan-esque dream?" into the report. And although I was like barely more than an intern at the time, I told them that I would quit if my name had to be in the report with that sentence in it. I was like, this is the end of it. I will forego my $8 an hour and put my foot down and just be a full-time bartender instead of a part-time bartender. It was a real stand. More importantly, There Goes the Neighborhood is engraved on Rodney Dangerfield's headstone. I don't know. And although it does have a sort of jokey connotation now, but it did originate, I think, from what I can tell, in the middle of the 20th century as a not jokey at all phrase bandied about by whites who were opposed to racial integration. And that was its original sort of use in the 1950s and so on. Really, it's about the departure of the familiar, fear of change, fear of blackness very often, but often terror of the unknown or the unfamiliar. But actually, not to confuse things for people, but the neighborhood remains. I mean, for the way I look at it, like, this is Capitol Hill, right? Despite what people say, Capitol Hill is still Capitol Hill. Even though the buildings have changed and the residents are always changing and the stores have changed, things have been changing here in this spot ever since humans first tried to inhabit the area. But that's enough for me. I'm so excited to bring our first reader to the stage. Ijeoma Oluo is a Seattle-based writer, speaker, and quote, internet yeller, I love that, called one of the most influential people in Seattle by Seattle Magazine. If you don't follow her on Twitter, that's a mistake. Her work on race, feminism, and other social issues has been featured in The Guardian, The Stranger, The Washington Post, Time Magazine, and more. She is the editor-at-large of The Establishment. Her book, So You Want to Talk About Race, came out earlier this year and was a New York Times bestseller and has been a great addition to our culture. And I'm so glad to welcome her to the stage right now.
I see you guys, but I'm assuming you look lovely. No heckling, mister. This is what happens when you bring your kids to things. Remember, I'm the one that feeds you. And I have to legally, but you don't have to enjoy it. So give that some thought. All right, can y'all hear me? All right. I was closing the worn metal gate of my fence when I noticed that it was looking even more worn than usual. Half of the gate was now barely attached to the fence post, still looking mostly closed, while also dangling from the one intact hinge at an odd angle. The entire length of that side of the gate was dented in. I said, with more curiosity than concern. Looks like someone hit our fence with their car. My 10-year-old narrowed his eyes and looked across the street at our neighbor's house. I bet James did it, he said. A few years ago, my neighbor James, the old Santa Claus-looking white dude who couldn't let a single neighbor pass by without a hello, would have been the last person that my son would accuse of driving into our fence. And while I don't think he drove into our fence, I fully understand why he was my son's first thought. First of all, he always pulls into our driveway, up to the fence in order to back his car into his driveway. Second, we don't like him. And he doesn't like us. So how did we get to this point? How did the neighborhood Santa become the dude that my son would think capable of damaging our property? Let me start at the beginning. Hold tight too, you guys, this is hella long. When I moved into this neighborhood a few years ago, I didn't really consider who my neighbors would be. I've always been a pretty private person. I'm a single mom, I work long hours, and I'm an introvert. I remember one time back in college when a young man knocked at my apartment door. He asked if he could borrow my laundry key. I grabbed the key, handed it to him, and wished him a good night. A few days went by, and my key hadn't been returned. As the days turned into weeks, I became anxious. I watched the basement laundry room door for someone exiting so I could run in and wash my clothes before they locked the door behind them. And as I stood in the dark basement, my imagination started to get the best of me. What if he didn't even live in this apartment building? What if he wanted the key so he could hide in the corner of the dark basement and attack me? What if he just wanted to see if I would answer my door to a random dude? About 2 months later, there was a knock on my door, and I answered it. A random dude was standing there. "Hello?" I said. "Hey," he said cheerfully. "I forgot to bring your laundry key back. I just found it the other day. So sorry about that." Oh, it was the same dude. As I took my key with relief, he added, "I'm surprised you didn't come ask for it back after all this time." "Oh," I explained, "I didn't know where you live. I didn't even know you live in this building." He looked at me confused for a moment and then asked in a somewhat offended voice, "Then why did you give me your key?" I shrugged, and then he turned around and walked up the stairs into the apartment directly above mine. There are only 4 apartments in my building. It gets better. The next day, I went into my intro to political theory class and took the nearest open seat. That dude, my neighbor, was sitting right behind me. As I took a second to figure out why he looked familiar, he just shook his head at me sadly and then looked down at his textbook. So, like I was saying, when I bought my house, I wasn't really thinking about what my relationship with my neighbors was going to be like. I bought a little fixer-upper on a large lot. It was near the high school my older son would attend and near a park that my younger son could play in. Most importantly, I could afford it. I even had enough money left over in my loan approval to pay for some basic renovations to the house that still had its original 1954 kitchen, and from the flames that shot out of the wall when my son tried to plug in one too many chargers, its original 1954 electric. The renovation was quite the topic of interest on my sleepy street, where everyone but me was white, except for one other neighbor, and almost everyone was a retiree. Just about everybody stopped by at least once to see what was being done to my tiny cinder block house. Every time I stopped by to see how the work was progressing, I'd run into a neighbor who wanted to know the same thing. But no one, not even me, was more interested than James. He introduced himself to me almost immediately. He gave me a hearty welcome to the neighborhood and then proceeded to ask me about 800 questions about the work that was being done. I answered him as best as I could and thanked him for the welcome. "Anything you need, I'll be right across the street," he cheerfully exclaimed in his always too loud voice, while he plucked one of his suspenders with his thumb and tugged at his beard. I expected him to shout, "Ho, ho, ho," next. The next time I came to check in on the work, it was James, not the contractor, who first met me with updates of how things were going on under his watch. Later, I heard one of the construction workers complain that he didn't want to go outside to get supplies because, quote, "that old guy is out there and he keeps asking me questions." After a few months, the work was done and I was ready to paint the walls and then move my little family in. I was alone in one of the bedrooms, headphones on, painting away, when I turned around and saw James standing behind me, his old dog on a leash. I had barely recovered from the shock of suddenly discovering an old man and a dog in my house when he turned around and wandered into another room. "Just wanted to get in here and see how the work was progressing," he bellowed, and continued his uninvited inspection of my house, dog in tow. Despite his eccentricities and issues with boundaries, James and I got along pretty well at first. I was a homeowner now and planned to stay in my house for many years. I figured I should probably learn how to be neighborly. And I quickly discovered, when it came to neighbors, I didn't have a lot of friendly options. One day, shortly after moving in, I heard two men shouting in front of my house. "Hey, you! Hey!" I went outside on my porch to see what the commotion was about. Another neighbor, an old Asian man, was shouting at James. "Hey, you! Come fix my mailbox!" James walked over to the man and said, in a similarly loud voice, "Fix what now?" "My mailbox," the man shouted in an exasperated voice. "Fix it." James looked incredulous. "Why would I fix your mailbox?" The old man, even more exasperated, shouted, "Because it's broken." "I didn't break your mailbox," James shouted back. Now, the old man shouted at James as if he was a particularly unruly child. "I didn't say you broke it. I said to fix it." James was now almost purple with rage. "Why would I fix your mailbox when I didn't break it? You fix it." To which the old man threw up his hands and yelled, "Because I don't know how." A few months later, I was walking around the neighborhood and paused at this same neighbor's house, this time with my own neighborly curiosity. He was kneeling down in his yard, bobbing his head to the 90s hip-hop music he had blasting from a nearby boombox. I noticed he was meticulously grooming his freshly mowed lawn for any blade of grass that dared peek up above the rest, with a pair of household scissors. The man saw me and waved me over as he bellowed out, "Hello! You are so pretty! Come here!" Ever the sucker for a compliment from a random old person trimming his lawn with scissors, I walked over. As I approached, he sat the scissors down, stood up, and leaned into me conspiratorially. "Hey, you live next door, right?" I nodded yes. "Good. You rent or own?" "Own," I answered. "Very good, very good," he said, and excitedly motioned me towards his backyard. "Come here." He pointed to a tall tree by the fence between our homes. "See that tree there?" he said. "It needs to come down." "Oh?" I said, not really sure why I was being told this. "It's a dangerous tree," he explained while pointing to the large yet perfectly healthy-looking tree. "It needs to come down." "Okay," I said, still not quite sure where he was going with this. "I need you to pay for half of it," he said with a bright smile. I was taken aback. "Excuse me? But it's your tree." The old man smiled again, undaunted. "But it's so close to your house, it's almost your tree, too." But it's not my tree," I replied. "But if it falls, it might kill me or it might kill you. Equal chance, so you should pay for half." I stared at him confused for a few seconds longer. Then he patted me on the arm and said, "You think about it, okay?" And then went and picked up his scissors and continued giving his lawn a haircut. The incident faded from memory until months later when I was walking home from taking my younger son to the bus, and I heard shouting again. I looked down the street, and this time it was a different neighbor, a white woman, probably in her 60s. She was in the middle of the street with a fuzzy blanket with a giant picture of a lion on it tied around her neck like a cape, and she was holding a sword. "Goddamn taco balls," she shouted as she attacked the street, the bushes, and the nearby fence with the sword. I stood there for a few minutes wondering what to do. She wasn't hurting anybody with the sword, but from the sound it was making as she attacked the concrete, it was definitely a real sword. Another neighbor heard the commotion and came outside. "She's been under a lot of stress lately," he explained. Apparently, another neighbor saw the racket and called the police because before I could figure out what I should do about this sword lady, a police cruiser pulled up. The lady screamed in frustration and tossed the sword down. I watched at a distance as officers talked to her for a few minutes and then walked her inside. After a short while, the officers came back out to talk with me and the other neighbor who had joined me. "She's going through a rough time," he explained. "But we've calmed her down, and she's taking a nap. As the officer explained to us what had happened, I saw his partner reach down in the bushes and pick up the sword that the woman had flung. I was confused as I watched him carefully walk the sword into the woman's house. When the other officer came out, I asked, "What happened with the sword?" "Oh, that," he said. "I put it back in the house, under the couch." I mean, I was very glad that the police had responded to this woman with compassion and care, but this part had me stumped. "Wait, you gave her back the sword?" The officer shrugged and said matter-of-factly, "Well, it's her property. We can't just keep it." The next day, my son's dad came to drop him off, and as he was leaving, he said, "Hey, just so you know, some old lady down the street just threw a chair through her living room window." "Oh, yeah," I said. "She's going through a rough time." A few minutes later, she proudly marched down the street past my house, this time with an American flag tied around her as a cape, sword in hand. A neighbor called one of her children to come get her. I went to check on the damage to her house, and there were already neighbors there with a tarp and a staple gun, covering the giant hole that used to be her picture window. A few months later, I awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of glass breaking. Not the neighbor's window, my window. I jolted out of bed and rushed first into my son's bedroom to make sure that whatever was happening, they were safe. Despite the jarring crash that had woken me, the boys were, like most teens and preteens, deep in undisturbed sleep. Once I saw that they were okay, I took a deep breath, grabbed a flashlight, and went outside to see what had happened. I was surprised and relieved to not see anyone in my yard and to see all of my windows intact. I went back inside and tried to go back to sleep. By morning, it was all but forgotten. I got the kids off to school and then settled in at my desk by my window to work. I paused to look outside and saw another neighbor, one I hadn't really spoken to yet, wandering around my yard looking like she had lost something. I went to my front door, opened it, and said, "Good morning." She walked over to me and asked, "Did you see what happened to your car?" I looked at my car and I didn't see anything amiss at first, but after a few minutes I noticed that all 4 tires were flat. "Someone slashed your tires," she said, just as I was coming to the same conclusion. "They smashed your brake lights too," she added, for good measure. I walked around my car to survey the damage. Then when I got to the front of my car, near my son's bedroom window, I saw glass that wasn't a part of my car. A vodka bottle had been smashed into the window. The window was still intact, but the debris from the bottle told the story of quite the party being thrown in my front yard, and gave me the source of the breaking glass I had heard. I looked around my yard and sighed. Then I noticed my next-door neighbor's car. Its tires were slashed too. I walked up and down the street. The tires of every single car were slashed. Officers arrived to take statements. You could tell they were dreading the paperwork. "Chances are it was some kids from the high school out partying," the officer explained. "It's not very likely we'll be able to catch the perpetrators." I went inside and called my insurance company. I was surprised when the cops knocked on my door again about an hour later. "We got the guy," the officer said, sounding almost as surprised as I looked. "Already?" "Yeah," the officer chuckled. "Dude right next door, renting the garage apartment. I guess he got into an argument with his roommates and got drunk and went on a rampage. He got his roommates' cars too, and they turned him in the moment we knocked on their door. He said that he was mad, and he was either going to take it out on people or cars, so he chose cars. You got to be real mad to be able to slash 17 tires with a corkscrew." The officer shook his head in puzzled amusement and walked off. As my neighbors showed themselves to be more and more quirky, I found that I appreciated James's cheerful nosiness even more. We chatted a few minutes every day. I watered his roses for him when he and his wife went out of town. My kids knew him by name and even walked over to his house once when they locked themselves out of ours. Things were going smoothly until June 13th, 2016. I woke up to the news of the Pulse nightclub shooting. As a feeling human and as a queer Black woman, I was devastated by the news that so many people, many of them queer and trans people of color, had been gunned down in cold blood. I was still crying when James knocked on my door that morning. He was holding a clipboard and smiled at me, oblivious to my puffy, bloodshot eyes. "Howdy, neighbor," he bellowed in a voice that would have been too loud for 9 a.m. even if I hadn't been crying for hours. "I'm hoping you'll sign this petition for me." Still in a daze, I looked down at the clipboard in his hand. "See," he began to explain, "there are some men who like to pretend to be women in order to get into a women's bathroom." I looked more closely at the clipboard as the words that he was saying started to sink in. "And I'm part of a group of concerned citizens who are trying to keep our young girls safe in public restrooms." Still reeling with grief from the shooting and feeling overcome with horror at what my neighbor was trying to get me to sign, on this day of all days, I just shook my head repeatedly and shut the door. He continued to talk until the door shut. Then he stood there puzzled for a minute and then left. I sat and cried for a while more. I could handle the sword lady and the neighbor who was trying to con me out of tree removal money. Hell, I could even handle the tire slashing dude. But a bigot? A bigot actively working to deny basic rights to trans people? This would not do. I wrote him a letter. Explaining to him that I had trans friends, that my son had trans classmates, and they, and all people, deserved a safe place to pee. I explained how this petition was harming them, making them even more unsafe than they already were. I pointed out a few of the glaring flaws in this whole we have to start banning trans people from using bathrooms in order to keep kids safe nonsense. I closed by telling him that I had told my friends that they were safe in my home and my neighborhood. I pleaded with him not to make a liar out of me. A few days later, James walked over to talk about my letter. He hadn't heard about the shooting when he knocked on my door, and he apologized for his bad timing. He then tried to explain to me why he felt this petition was important. It didn't go well. As I countered every argument of his with actual facts, he finally said, "Well, I just think that we need to wait until people are ready to accept them instead of forcing it on us. They are a minority in this population. Why do they get to force these decisions on us?" "I am also a minority in this population," I answered. "And if we waited for the majority to be ready to accept Black people, I wouldn't be able to use a public restroom either." "Oh, so you're gonna make this about race now, are you?" Jim yelled, at a volume that I didn't even think was capable even for him. "Well, let me ask you this. You're a Black Lives Matter sign," he said, and pointed to the sign in my living room window. "You telling me that white lives don't matter?" "Get off of my property," I replied. James then backed up a foot or so that his feet were just beyond my property line. "I'm not on your property now. What are you going to do?" I went inside my house, and he spent the next hour or so pacing in front of it, yelling at nobody. When my children came home, I gave them a condensed version of what happened and told them not to go over to James's house anymore. My teenager said, "Oh man, that really bums me out." And my younger son looked at the sign in our window and said, "That's my Black Lives Matter sign." Things escalated over the next couple of months. He kept trying to find petty ways to get back at me for seeing him who he really was instead of the neighborhood Santa Claus. After that, I gave up on being neighborly. I knew that being the only Black family on our street might be a bit awkward, but I grew up in Seattle, so that was an awkwardness I was prepared for. But my first few years in this new house had been much rougher than I had anticipated. My little home that I had worked and scrimped and saved so hard for didn't seem like home. As the hateful vitriol of the presidential election reached fever pitch, I looked at my neighbor's lawn, now filled with signs for conservative candidates, and wondered if I could really live here as long as I had first anticipated. "I bet James is going to vote for Trump," my younger son said as his fears about the election grew. One fall day, a neighbor, the one who had explained to me that the neighbor down the street was going through a rough time, knocked on my door. I was at this point pretty hesitant to answer the door for any neighbor, but he could see me through the living room window, so I couldn't just sit there and pretend like I wasn't there. I answered the door, and my neighbor was looking at me with a concerned expression. "Hey, neighbor. We live just a few houses down, and we haven't seen you out much. Not walking with your kids like you used to, not working on your yard." He looked slightly embarrassed and said, "I figured I would just stop by to see if everything was okay." I started crying. I told him what had happened with James, how heartbreaking and stressful it was to not feel safe in your own neighborhood. It was a full, snotty, ugly cry. My neighbor set his jaw and looked over at James's place. "Can you get me one of those signs?" he asked. I nodded and he added, "Actually, make it 2. Let him come and ask me what I think about white lives." My family and I had dinner at their house a few weeks later. They were open and loving and kind. My children were relieved to have a neighbor they could smile at. So was I. The day after the election, they called me to make sure that we were okay. His wife asked if I wanted to go to a protest with her and her daughter. I started to feel like I could breathe again. I noticed that one of my neighbors was always wearing Seahawks jerseys. I asked him if he wanted these copies of Sports Illustrated that I'd suddenly start getting out of the blue, even though I have no interest in sports and don't remember signing up for any magazines in the last 10 years. He eagerly accepted and stopped by a few weeks later to tell me how much he was enjoying them. That Christmas, his wife brought us homemade cookies with a note that said, "To our new neighbors." After my neighbor put up his Black Lives Matter signs, a neighbor 2 houses down from him put on her own sign welcoming diversity to our neighborhood. A neighbor across the street put up a sign denouncing yet another attempt at removing trans bathroom rights. I started walking around the neighborhood again. My neighbor, who likes to cut his grass with scissors, started coming by to borrow my tools and lawn equipment. When he'd return it, he'd give me advice on getting the moss off my roof or getting rid of weeds. Then he'd thank me for the loan and walk back over to his yard to listen to his hip-hop. A few weeks later, I heard shouting again. But this time it was James, just in his regular, too loud talking voice. He was complaining to a friend who had stopped by. First, we had this Black Lives Matter sign. Now there are 2 at that house, and that sign down there, and this one about transgender people. What is happening to my neighborhood? I smiled to myself and thought, it's not your neighborhood anymore, James. This is a neighborhood that patches up neighbors' broken windows, that yells about mailboxes, that wields swords, and borrows power tools. It's a neighborhood that goes to protests and believes that Black Lives Matter and that trans people deserve to be treated like people. It's not your neighborhood anymore. It's my neighborhood.
So prior to his move to Seattle 3 years ago, Nick Droz spent most of a decade writing and playing in Austin, Texas. He pens and performs songs frequently for the Bushwick Book Club, who it's an organization dedicated to the creation of new music inspired by literature, and they're going to be doing a bunch of events at the new Hugo House next year, so look for them there. His writing has led him to a number of collaborations with other local organizations, including Jack Straw Writers, Seattle 7 Writers, and Seattle Arts and Lectures. And it's my pleasure to welcome Nick to the stage.
I got out with blessings on my breath and judgment in my mouth, conscience clear, some vague thread that I framed inside my rearview mirror. I said, there goes the neighborhood. There goes the neighborhood. To hell with it. spend your days making neighbors into friends. You never spoke the phrase, there goes the neighborhood. There goes the neighborhood. Never once. We stayed in touch, but never once did I turn up at your invite or anyone's. We grew gray, and I finally returned on your funeral day. It occurred to me that you worked to build a home, and I expected one for free. Saying there goes the neighborhood. Oh, there goes the neighborhood. Oh, there goes the neighborhood. Such wasted breath.
So it's my great pleasure to introduce Tarfia Faizullah now, and she is the author of Registers of Illuminated Villages, which came out recently from the wonderful Grey Wolf Press. Yeah. And it's garnered already a bunch of wonderful reviews, just like 2 months ago. It came out. And her first book, Seam, came out in 2014 from Crab Orchard Series in Poetry, the winner of a Vita Award, GLCA New Writers Award, Milton Kessler First Book Award, Drake University Emerging Writer Award, and other honors. Her poems have been translated into Persian, Chinese, Bengali, Tamil, Spanish, and featured at the Smithsonian, the Rubin Museum of Art, and elsewhere. Recipient of 3 Pushcart Prizes, the Frederick Bach Prize from Poetry Magazine, and other honors. In 2016, she was recognized by Harvard Law School's Women Inspiring Change. Faizullah currently, like now, is still teaching at the University of Michigan Helen Zell Writers Program as the Nicholas Del Banco visiting professor in poetry, and then she's moving to Chicago soon, and will be there for a year teaching as well. And it's my great pleasure to bring her to the stage right now. Thank you.
Hi, all. It's going to take me a second to get organized. Okay. Comfort is everything.
Help me, Peter.
Get us to move this way. Oh, sorry.
Cool.
There you go.
Yay, thank you.
Now it's more balanced.
Usually when I have my phone up here, I make a joke about my mom texting me, but she's actually here tonight, so I can't make that joke anymore. So I was kind of anxious about this reading, A, because I'm reading new work, and that's always really nerve-wracking, I think. And also because in my head, I was sort of like checking all my poems, like, does this relate to the theme? Does this relate to the theme? And so I'm not going to talk in between poems very much, just I hope you'll hear the connection between what I wrote and the theme. I feel like the one thing I want to say before I get started is that a number of these poems also sort of use a different word for neighborhood. One of the things that the theme made me think about are different ways of thinking about a neighborhood. So you'll hear village or tent city at times too, but I'm sort of thinking about those other places that have different language for a neighborhood. All right, here we go. Patience is a virtue. Now that I've stopped scowling, my toothbrush rests solo on the porcelain lips of sinks, and I live with rituals of faith in my own rooms. Sometimes faith means flinching away from stacks of spam. Sometimes it looks like two skull-capped neighborhood newcomers holding hands in the rain. Sometimes it looks like a headscarfed girl with her hair cut straight across her forehead. And those days, I nod unkissed lips when everyone was a slamming door until the right phone call came. Sometimes I saw my elders nestle their heads together to laugh and cry with folks whose names I knew only via those blue aerogram envelopes. I've been so afraid of losing the connection, of scratching through cement walls until I'm hexed or deaf. Once, in a winter storm, I made a wrong turn down a street unpaved of its scores of snow and couldn't get out. Eyes ablaze, I pressed my hot forehead against fear. The coolness of ice keeling open the window was the worry I wasn't strong enough to die. Then the brevity of my lips that might never kiss you for the first time again parted, and I drank myself back to tomorrow until the fortune of my own death was once again tucked away. I reversed and drove my way back to you. Strange shall I choose. When will I learn that patience is water, unafraid to be snow before melting to admire its new leaves? Yesterday, I learned that the human brain and the mind are the same thing, but a surgeon can only cut into one. I still cradle my head in one palm to make any corner a neighborhood. I forget daily that a hand can shawl the nape of a neck after it's held a scalpel. Patience is a virtue, a one-eyed man once said to me. Sure, I thought, but when? I'm a big word junkie, so I learned. I get really excited when I learn a new word, and I get to use it in a poem. So this is a poem called "Obad with Blue-Tongued Skink," ending with autotomy, which is something a lizard can do. They can kind of break off their own appendages. Isn't that a cool word, autotomy? Okay. Inside a neighborhood silted with the names of former lovers, a man runs his thumb along the circumference of a plastic pomegranate. He doesn't know what led him here, but he knows he is empty, which means the lungs and heart and spleen offer little to no recognizable data. Allahu Akbar, the blue-tongued skink no longer sings. Refusing to subdue from blades of grass, the man slips between the bars of her cage. North of here, the boy he once was is locked out of his own voice in snow that feathers and whorls but never pricks. He fears his father will never stop preaching inside the cathedral of a gun, while the girl who will become me dreams she is not a lizard, but a starfish who grows back every one of my amputated arms. He leans into a palm tree. I see a boy bracing himself. No, I see the hubris of the bumblebee. No, I see myself, blotched and brainy, blue-tongued skink, ready to break off my own tail to escape any neighborhood of captivity. At H&R Block, I remember loving you. That's when it happens, right? When you're like at H&R Block, it's the worst. At H&R Block, I remember loving you. Back then, we clung tight, like dandelions hot glued. I knocked back another styrofoam cup of coffee, At H&R Block, I remember loving you. The police showed up the first time I lost you. I answer questions about penalties and properties. Especially then, we clung tight, didn't we? Dandelions, superglued. We tried to start over, icicle new. The agent considers me with pity or curiosity. At H&R Block, I remember loving you. There were my scars, yours, our post-colonial 4 a.m. blues. Is it just you, or do you live with somebody? More coffee? The answer, we clung tight, like dandelions rubber glued, in tornado and torrent until, I thought, the tomb. We were the perfect storm, and I was your sweet pea. At H&R Block, I remember loving you. Our scars tell us when lightning's coming, it's true. I can't be part of a pod. I'll just accrue more ghost money. But back then, I clung to you, a dandelion unglued. At H&R Block, I decide to forget loving you. I hear hydration is really key. I have a friend who recently said to me, she was like, I really hate water. And then she took like a really dramatic swig of it. It was great. This is a poem called Who's Winning and How. I give up. Can there be more to say? Well, there's a stained spoon across the floorboards, or Mercury is once again in retrograde, or WTF is a supermoon anyway. I'm still cringing away the memory of the peanut butter I swaddled in a cold tortilla and ate in bed. That's a true story. There are nights my shame over what I do without me is as loud as the gunshots I don't hear, i.e., the volume is turned up on my dread. I turn over and over in my flowered flannel before I rise to list what must be done. So much depends on a prawn. I am angry at God for how much I love chicken. I really do try to regularly spin my legs in place for 45 to 60 minutes approximately, mostly to eradicate the neighborhood's fried ravioli. You've heard these arguments before. You also have guilt nestled in a basket alongside the bananas and fitness goals. You also have the blinds and curtains drawn, but let's face it, the light likes to curl and snarl. But the real question remains, what am I to do with nights I spent in a village on the other side of the world? There, I shit my own acid-washed denim in an outhouse with my head covered. No shit, as in, I'm serious. Oh, I swam and swam. The stars were strong and loud. I had no reason to wonder who was winning or how. You're from Austin. I went to school there, so this is a poem that takes place in Austin. Dark tuning. The hearing aid was warm from his ear when he slipped it into mine, and what I remember isn't the brief blazing of his fingers along my earlobe, but that he turned away after, which seems correct, since we should be alone, the first time we're allowed the frequency of each unheard percussion in this world. I could have stayed in those tingles for longer than I'll ever live. For hours, I'd wait standing on Congress Ave for the frenzy of bats to come and unskin the horizon for us. As a child, I understood the dark turning I saw hanging from a ledge in Carlsbad Caverns was love. Two bats climbing instinctively into each other, closing themselves into a soundless, 8-chambered hymn only they could shatter. I understand now. It takes a village of savage stalactites to show I live for the dripping and speechless ache for the vault of your mouth. If love is learning to gnaw and be gnawed, to be stringed and strung up, let me be your raw instrument, be the steadfast eyes of the luthier bent in lamplight, who contours this excess away from me, until the melodies we forget to echo, even in disquiet, will echo. So, one of the things I was thinking about when I thought about this theme was my own upbringing. I have an amazing friend. We've known each other since we were 5 years old. She was the only black girl in class. I was the only brown girl. And when we were in second grade, our teacher separated us because we were laughing too hard. And we decided then to communicate with each other via telepathy. And I think it worked because how many years is it? So 33 years later, we're still best friends, and we still have really weird sort of like, I was just thinking about that moments. And recently she actually came up to Austin where I was doing a reading and crashed with me in my hotel room. And we got in trouble again for laughing. The front desk called us at like 1 o'clock in the morning, and they're like, we need to be quiet. We heard a news complaint. And we just looked at each other like, how is this still happening so many years later? Anyway, so this is a poem that I wrote for her after spending New Year's with her this past year. New Year's with you, with love to Javon. Soon we will eat oysters by the unabashed dozen, hot sauce and lemon for me, mignonette for you. For now, though, I stream bass-heavy beats through speakers in a 2-bedded hotel room you reserved, and we accustom ourselves to the oddness of friendship in adulthood, act brand new until we forget again we haven't always been sisters. You, still married. Me, divorced. We stand in front of the mirror, and you color in your face with a dark pencil to conceal the pale spots the disease has made more observable. Beside you, I drag a brush first through silver, then livid lavender. Soon, you'll shrug the old familiar shoulders into a camel coat, but not before admiring the drape of the velvet cape I've rediscovered, the one I wore to prom, remember? Red lipstick, fake leather, your wedding ring, my gold bangle. Old friend, I always miss you more when we're together. We still don't flinch at the sight of neighborhood sirens, and we both crave the slow and salty devour. We still get in trouble for laughing too loud. We still fight over the white girls we once loved, the ones who now don't bother. I know we live in darker worlds, even we do not know how to share with each other. But for now, they're ours, aren't they? These briny and slender-wristed hours. Ours, 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 and ours. Poem full of worry ending with my birth. This is just like the poem in which I'm just like, I'm so anxious all the time though, seriously. I worry that my friends will misunderstand my silence as a lack of love or interest instead of a tent city built for my own mind. I worry I can no longer pretend enough to get through another year of pretending I know that I understand time, though I can see my own hands. Sometimes I worry over how to dress in a world where a white woman wearing a scarf over her head is assumed to be cold, whereas with my head cloaked, I am an immediate symbol of a war folks have been fighting eons deep before I was born, a meteor. I just had a couple of poems left. I just want to take a second to thank y'all for being here tonight. I was thinking about what you were saying about being an introvert, which I completely relate to. And it just is a real honor to be here with you and to be here with you too, Lydia. Thank you. And thank you to Peter and Tree and Hugo House for having me. And thanks to my mom for showing up. This is her first reading, y'all. It's really exciting. This is called The Snake Princess Speaks, and it's a persona poem, and it ends with a couple of lines I stole from Nazim Hikmet, who has just really good lines, so thank you to Nazim Hikmet. The guard wasn't found dead outside the gates. He was dead because he was found inside of me. Those days, it was novel to glide and preen, for my scales bright as pines beside a quiet pond to scintillate anyone. Firstborn, I didn't inhabit space, I slunk from it and left the wet smudge of other histories behind. Toddlers squealing bare-souled into spring's first news of newt and spawn, the dawn my father the king caught us and sank his scythe down deep into the warm aftermath of our tussling. I hissed and gnawed, but he didn't stop until he had whipped silt, stone, and water lily from me. But I didn't lay crumpled and caged for long. I sank my fangs into myself and drank my own blood. I was bewilderment, and no one could rescue me. No one knows my true name, but the right player can thrum it right out of me for free. Dancers still wear armfuls of red bangles that clink whispers of love despite moss. Damselflies glistened by, and nightly I inhaled the wild waters of each of my villages, which is to say, there is more to say about bangles, more time to laugh beneath the swamp song of the moon. Did I want to kill my father? Once I coiled around him until he couldn't draw a breath. I just remember the stars. I didn't know I loved the trees. This is going to be my last poem. Thank you all again so much for having me. This is a ghazal, and do y'all remember that song that's like, this is the song that never ends because it goes on and on, my friend. Some people start not singing, hey, and it goes like on and on forever and ever. Yeah, so this is a ghazal, but I put a turn in it to make it go on forever and ever and ever, which is, I guess, my way of sort of like punishing myself in a way. But so this is an infinity ghazal beginning with the recollection of having once had lice. Yeah. Okay. Across two oceans, my aunt drew the comb through my hair steady, so as not to allow what feeds on human blood to eat my inner tree. Where now is the word for that level of intimacy? I knew it once, but now all I see is my village burnt of our rarest trees. My point is, it takes a long time to say, I am a fire hazard, or a household of rare birds is another way to say tree. Across two oceans, my aunt can barely speak. Don't forget, her name is Husnahena, a tree, night-blooming jasmine specifically. Two oceans from here, the names of saplings are perfuming the wind with their leaves. A sapling, of course, being a small and soft tree, i.e., a baby tree. In that other country, I ate rice with salt from a palm leaf. I was then unable to fully marvel, how finely formed is a tree? A man I loved once told me to stop putting oceans in my poems. Well, oceans and oceans and oceans, and drowning so many trees. Night-blooming jasmine tree, baby tree, the once and future tree. Lately, all I think about are trees. Read this poem again and replace trees with refugees. Tarfia means joy in the margins, and one who lies to protect the names of trees. Thank you.
Also, those were beautiful. This song actually, while I was trying to figure out what I was going to do for the third tune, I was kind of running out of ideas, so I went back to some stuff I had shelved, and this actually came out of a group that I wrote tunes with, just sort of a monthly project thing, all based out of Austin. Anyway, here it is. Lit cigarette, burning slow and tender, half-smoked Winston on the frozen ground outside St. John's, seeing double, snapping back lit pictures of the town. Line it up, be exact. two-way telephone. Broken handset hanging, take the picture and then advance the reel. The last call placed while it was working. You found the nerve to tell him how you feel. Line it up, be exact, check the light, set the flash, a perfect shot won't change the facts. Expose the film just enough to develop it. Hang it up, a photograph can't take you back. Recollections are sweeter on 35 millimeter. It's almost like you could be there, but a miss as good as a mile. That neighborhood, just like you remember a giant pothole. You sprained your ankle in, frame the shot, hit the shutter. The playground where you fought the neighbor kid. Line it up, be exact, check the light, set the flash, a perfect shot won't change the facts. Expose the film just enough to develop it. Hang it up, a photograph can't take you back. Expose the film just enough to develop it. Hang it up, a photograph can't take you back.
Lidia Yuknavitch is the author of the best-selling novels The Book of Joan and The Small Backs of Children, which is the winner of the 2016 Oregon Book Awards Ken Kesey Award for Fiction, as well as the Reader's Choice Award. The novel Dora, A Head Case, and a critical book on war and narrative, Allegories of Violence. Her widely acclaimed memoir, The Chronology of Water, was a finalist for the Penn Center USA Award for Creative Nonfiction and a winner of the PNBA Award and the Oregon Book Awards Reader's Choice. She's done a lot of writing. But a book based on her TED Talk, The Misfits Manifesto, was released in October 2017. She founded the workshop series Corporeal Writing in Portland, Oregon, don't say Oregon, where she teaches both in person and online. She received her doctorate in literature from the University of Oregon, and it's my great pleasure to welcome her to the station.
La 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 la. Eh? Eh? Is that okay? I trust you. Period. First, I want to thank all mammals Hugo House. Can you give them another round? I really appreciate your including me. I'm happy to come here anytime, anywhere, and do anything you want. You could just hand me something, I'll try it. Secondly, why don't you stand up for like 2 seconds? Seriously, I think our blood drops to our asses when we're at readings, and it's really weird. And like, put your hands right. It's so weird. Even if you love it, it's like the blood like settles in your ass. It's so weird. And you made it. You made it to the last reader, which is always like slightly fucked. I really appreciate your being here. And so before I do anything else, I'm so thrilled to be included with these amazing 3 artists tonight, like you wouldn't believe. So first, let me just bow. And you too, because you're awesome. And partly because I know things are kind of, go like this. Things are a little bit fucked right now. But the upside is the mono story is in danger. And multiple storytelling, multiple lives, multiple bodies, multiple voices are rising. And you're next. And I give my whole heart and body to you, because you're the future. And it's time. So thank you for even letting me join you. My plug-in to the theme, my friend Omar Al-Akkad has a great phrase about the book he just wrote that won the Oregon Book Award called American War. Anybody seen it, read it? Homework. He said, my book is a stone cold bummer. And it's called American War, so. This story is a stone cold bummer, but I'm not sorry, and here's why. It's kind of an homage to some young women I worked with at a community college where I taught for 20 years. And there was a special program for young women who'd been part of sex trafficking lives and got out. And so this is a story about a young woman who entered that reality and what happens to her there. And it's literally a love story to a woman I worked with. And a thing you may or may not know is that Portland, Oregon has a terribly high rate of sex trafficking, particularly among Eastern European women, which is what this story centers on. I haven't looked up the stats for Seattle. I would assume it's similar, to be honest with you, because Northwest, right? So this story is for her. And I want to remind you that sad is not bad. Sad can be revolutionary. This is all to try to help you through this story. I'm about to read you. Also, I have no water, and I feel like that's going to be a problem at some point. So if somebody wants to like shoot me some, that'd be awesome. Thank you. Second language. She tucked the corners of her face in and went back out into the world, knowing that the blood leaking into the street behind her would repulse at least some bystanders. Eerily, the blue veins standing out in her neck and at her temples made her look vaguely like an aerial map of Siberia, even though in this place she knew the word Siberia did not signify. Somehow she took comfort in how Siberian her neck and temple and veins looked, and walked with a slightly straighter spine, a girl of the north, not from here. Though some people she passed looked at her with a kind of disaffected American latte pity, it made a lot of sense to her. Her mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother had been Lithuanian and had survived winters and had been sold to Russians and had died in white and cold and poverty. And so a vast white expanse with rivulets of black and blue was a concept she actually understood in her body. Didn't land look that way to birds on great journeys? Birds had outlived the ice age. Perhaps my body is like a map of a place seen from the sky, she thought. She looked up, and then she returned her gaze to the faces of this weird American city. She had a vague understanding that her insides were weirdly visible on the outside, and how not the custom that appeared to be with other people, but what were exposed capillaries and dangling entrails compared to the fat wallets of billionaire businessmen jutting from the asses of their fine suits, their political power, or the violently painted lips of women with hairstyles and manicures rivaling their mortgage payments. She looked up. Gray sky, gray buildings, cement with wind. At least there were trees here. Trees never lie. But where in the world, she wondered, were the gray wolves? Pulsing outward, she made her way to the front man whose address she'd been given when she arrived through Canada in a popsicle truck painted entirely white. Girls like popsicles driven over stitched borders between nations. Apparently, this kind of front man did not regard an inside-out girl as unusual or damaged. She still had her use value in this place, is what she understood the man on the phone to mean when he said this, "Are you at least a C-cup?" Her heart hidden between the new pillows of her adolescence. The front man lived near a freeway. What freedom was it meant, this freeway? In a snot-colored two-story house with black plastic in the windows where curtains should be. And when she knocked on the door, her throat cords braided and her vertebrae clattered. And the man who answered the door looked to be in his late teens, older than her. Inside were more girl popsicles, most of them looking to be around 12 or 13. One might be 14, but tallness wasn't necessarily a sign of age in girls. Two seemed young enough to need mothers. She stared at the melting popsicles, her kin, all of them with too thin, too white wrists wound with bulging blue rivulets. But the television in the living room bombarded her senses with image and sound in waves and distracted her. She bit down on her tongue enough to feel it. Good blood in a mouth, a warmth that delivers you. Days went by, enough to create time. She ate, she slept, she was a girl. In the evenings, every evening, she was delivered to some new address. And each address had an old gray man billionaire with money enough for a girl's body and thread enough to take her life. The pretend pretty of the Portland city all around her days, disposable cartons and plastic and paper and coffee, and black clothes and bike lanes and funny little hats and eating and driving and thousands of kinds of potato chips, whole aisles at grocery stores devoted to potato chips, salty ones and square ones and green, blue, yellow, red ones, chips with pepper and chips with vinegar and some with barbecue flavor reddened with dye, coffee spilling from the mouths of hundreds of shops and beer everywhere, and strip clubs outnumbering McDonald's, which is true in Portland. For real. She wondered if all these regular, well-dressed people walking around like Bic lighters had been to strip clubs, or if she was the only one, and if they did go, were they the same after? Her emotional circuitry interrupted every time she took off her clothes. Of the land in this Portland, there were mountains, and she remembered that terrain could still overtake humans, sometimes. She wished she could hear their stories, but she couldn't from where she was boxed. She saw the lively mouths and freshly sculpted bodies and the surface sheen of the people in this city. She saw their righteous bicycling circles and their corner coffees and their neon signage and the stutter of bridges over incarcerated rivers. And still, even walking the sidewalk, smelling the pee and rotting food mixed with car exhaust and wet leaves and dirt, she could see that the money and consumption were what the place was made of. Everyone seemed to be worth much. How did they wear their eyes so easily? Didn't they see they'd bought them? Sometimes while walking, she witnessed animal behavior as blue jays adopting different languages, gardener snakes escalating over cement into their shrub havens, the cacophony of frogs under overpasses near streams or gutters. Walking nowhere reflected back to her a sense of non-being she could almost live with. Sometimes she stopped to sit in the dirt, and an old beer would tumble by. Coors, it said. She considered trying to speak to other mammals, but her voice locked in her throat when she thought of what was she, a girl with nothing, not even a family, no money, no language, a name without documents? And then all she could feel was the warm cave between her legs and the small and sure soft swell of each of her breasts, and she thought, well, at least my body has meaning. In the evenings, when she was delivered like a cardboard box from a UPS truck, or recycling beside the garbage, sifted through by big green rubber-gloved hands, or flowers that lose scent before their meaning travels. In the evening, she went dead. Her every night destinations threatened to unweave her intestines and pour them out in gray mucus lines onto the street. Somewhere in her skull or ribcage was the hint of old ideas. Something called family, something called home lingered, but the memories were not strong enough to negate their absence in this place. In this place, her being was body money. In this place, it was be or die. This night, like every other, the doorway to the hotel looked to her like the drooped, yawning mouth of a sick old man who'd lost the elastic in his skin. Repetition makes something real, so that every night of things entering a body until a creature path got born in her. Her eyeballs shivered and her rib cage made a sound in the wind like chimes. Knocking on the hotel door took a lot more than girl. Well, she thought, even if I am entering the loose-skinned mouth of a saggy old man, a job's a job. That's a phrase in America, a job's a job. A phrase she'd accepted from the mouths of other popsicles. Because do not behave like an immigrant. Do not out yourself. Language is a funny thing, she thought. It opens and closes. It saves lives or kills people. It trips you like a crack in the sidewalk. On the television in the whole bedroom of the slackened old gray man, her John for the evening, was a war zone. Just between the old gray John's legs spread over her face, she could see the televised rubble, the huddled clumps of human crouched and lurching and running. Suck, he said. Deflated, bad-tasting balloons filled the wet opening of her mouth, and the rubble and the humans and the CNN ticker tape. She closed her eyes and did. He fingered into her. He said this, I'm a very important man. I'm the most important man. I'm the biggest man. There was one thing besides her body that she possessed, and it was this, a story. In a foreign tongue, but still a story, and always upon her return to the front man's cement house, she would relate the story to the other popsicles. She didn't know why she retold it, only that telling it couldn't be stopped. Long ago in a faraway land, there was a Tsar who had a magnificent orchard, an orchard second to none. However, every night a firebird would swoop down on the Tsar's best apple tree and fly away with a few golden apples. And the Tsar ordered each of these 3 sons to catch that firebird alive and bring it to him. It was such a treasure. So the 2 elder brothers fell asleep while watching, and the youngest son, Ivan, saw the firebird and grabbed it by the tail, but the bird managed to wiggle out of Ivan's grasp, leaving him only a bright tail feather. Ivan, assisted by a gray wolf, who killed his horse and then felt sorry for him, because even wolves understand how unfortunate puny men are, managed to get not only the firebird, but also a wonderful horse and a princess named Elena the Fair. The wolf was smarter than the man. And when they came to the border of Ivan's father's kingdom, Ivan and Elena stopped to rest, and while they were sleeping, Ivan's 2 older brothers, returning from their unsuccessful quest, came across the 2 and killed Ivan, threatening Elena to do the same if she told what had happened. They ravaged Elena and threatened to cut out her tongue, because this is how fairy tales work. Ivan lay dead for 30 days until the gray wolf came back and revived him with water of death and water of life. And Ivan came to his home palace at the wedding day of Elena the Fair and the brother. And the Tsar asked for an explanation. And Elena, with the wolf standing guard, gnashing his teeth, told him the truth. And the Tsar was furious and threw the elder brothers into prison. And the wolf ate their entrails out into the night and scattered them everywhere. And Ivan and Elena the Fair married, inherited the kingdom, and lived happily ever after. None of the popsicles ever said a word about this strange story she told them, but her telling brought sleep lapping over them each night. Time passed, enough for her to realize in the every night that no gray wolves would come. And although she knew that stories had beginnings and middles and ends, she also knew that for her and for those displaced like her, the order of things was out of whack, and there was no language and there was no body coming to save her. Once story had been like home, but now story had been fragmented and gnawed at the edges. Once there were heroes and saviors, but they had turned into con artists in reality TV and the dizzy whir of consumers and billionaires. Or maybe there never were heroes and saviors, and those stories were only meant to trick girls into forgetting how to be animals. Strength in a girl from Eastern Europe lengthens her spine, the beauty of her neck and back. Strength in a girl like her made her eyes smaller and more steely, her jaw more square, her cheekbones high, canted clamshells. Even her collarbone spoke. But in this place, people didn't seem to hear. They responded with dead stares or shrugged shoulders. What you need, they always said, is to speak better English. She longed for the gray wolves, furred and growling and teethed, to rip loose the entrails of enemies. Her last night in the cement house, in the hours before dawn, after she was delivered back to the house of ravaged popsicles, after she had again told the story from her mother dead, her grandmother dead, her great-grandmother dead, after she washed the blood from her mouth, her nipples, from between her legs where she realized life would never pass the way it had moved from the cleft of her mother, her grandmother, her great-grandmother, and the blood from the smaller aperture of her ass, the rivulets of red winding their way down the rusted drain holes of an unclean shower, when she put herself down on a formless mattress on the floor under a window of the house filled with girl popsicles, the cave of her cement world opening up. And through the window, she could see the towering white-eyed angels hovering over them, streetlights they're called here, and a night watch of lost leaves whispered against her hair, and tin and paper rustlings made urban lullabies. Or maybe it was just the ugly end of the city, like everyone kept saying on television, where girls go to disappear and die. She wondered if death could transform into an animal by her own hand, not as an ending, but as a blue-whitened pulsar. Couldn't it, blazing the entire night sky apart and atomizing everything ever done to girls in the history of girls, couldn't deranged gray wolves come back from old stories, from native lands, to tear out the throats and sag balls of old gray Johns? Couldn't they enter through astral projections, ancient as folktales embedded in the dead bones of her mother and her grandmother and her great-grandmother and hers, gone to dirt but still alive in storytelling? Weren't there still secret triumphs, secret powers to living dead girls? Couldn't there be? There were. She could feel it. Without thinking, she punched a hole with her fist through the window in the cinder block box. She elbowed the hole until it was big enough for the popsicles to leave, elbow blood everywhere, and then, quiet as a mother's voice singing a child to sleep in mother tongue, they each slipped out, all ages of girls in nightgowns and underwear, just these quiet moths. They slipped out of the jagged window, and as the popsicles tumbled out into the night like child refugees, oh, how they glowed like human snowflakes underneath the streetlights. She knew what else to do. She had to conjure the gray wolves, not the old gray, wrong, billionaire American man wolves, but the real wolves. So she took the broken pieces of window glass and gutted herself so that her entrails were finally fully free and right. And they slithered out in vivid shades of girl onto the floor. Someone must stay behind to make the story. And it did, for only then did the real gray wolves smell it. Her entrails, animal and good, and they came down from the mountains, 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, 20, and entered the cinder block house and ripped the throats from the wrong-headed men and tore them limb from limb. And the wolves' teeth and the howls reminded everyone everywhere how there is something from spine and ice that has yet to form a language, a yet unfinished sentence, one those bought and sold Eastern European girls are learning besides English. They are learning to gut themselves open so that others will run. I tell you, do not go near that place. Don't go near it. Gray wolves guard the ground there. They will eat you alive. Girls are growing from guts enough for a body and a language all the way out of this world. Thanks.